This comprehensive analysis will explore the multiple dimensions of inflationary pressures in the US economy, considering not only the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, but also the geopolitical effects of Middle Eastern instability and the diminishing impact of stimulus measures. Each factor is examined in depth to illustrate how they could cumulatively drive the US towards stagflation, a dangerous economic scenario characterized by stagnant growth, high inflation, and high unemployment. Tariffs and rising inflationary pressures. The tariffs implemented by the Trump administration targeted China and several other major trading partners, aiming to boost domestic industries but ultimately increasing inflationary pressure on the economy. These tariffs, applied to a wide range of imported goods, have raised the cost of essential raw materials and consumer products. Research from the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, highlights that tariffs function like a tax on imports, which increases production costs for domestic businesses and consumer prices for imported goods. The increased costs, often passed on to consumers, have had far-reaching inflationary impacts, particularly on low- and middle-income households who feel the effects of price increases more acutely. The Federal Reserve has observed that these tariffs have added up to 20% in extra costs on certain goods from China, making basic items like electronics, clothing, and food more expensive. The impact of tariffs is particularly severe on the manufacturing sector, which depends heavily on imported components. For example, the Peterson Institute for International Economics found that the tariffs imposed on aluminum and steel raised prices for industries that rely on these materials, including the automotive, aerospace, and construction sectors. For manufacturers, these higher input costs result in cost-push inflation, where price increases are driven by elevated production costs rather than by consumer demand. This dynamic causes businesses to raise their prices to maintain profitability, further increasing inflationary pressure on the broader economy. The subsequent rise in consumer prices often leads to a decline in real disposable income, reducing the purchasing power of households and creating an environment where consumer spending, a key component of GDP growth, starts to shrink. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, has documented the impact of tariffs on core inflation, noting that certain sectors have seen inflation rates far above the national average due to increased costs from tariffs. Over time, these tariffs compound their effects as businesses adjust pricing models, reduce hiring, or invest less in growth initiatives. According to the American Economic Review, prolonged exposure to such inflationary pressures can lead to sticky inflation, where elevated prices become entrenched even after tariffs are lifted. This entrenched inflation can have lasting negative effects on the economy, including diminished consumer confidence and reduced investment in innovation and expansion. Rising oil prices and Middle Eastern instability. Alongside the pressure from tariffs, escalating instability in the Middle East, particularly in oil-producing nations, has the potential to drive oil prices higher, resulting in inflationary effects across numerous economic sectors. Oil remains one of the most influential commodities in the world economy, and price fluctuations have a wide-reaching impact on various industries, from transportation to manufacturing. When oil prices rise, they drive up costs for businesses reliant on fuel and transportation, which in turn leads to higher prices for goods and services. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, estimates that a 10% increase in oil prices typically results in a 0.3% rise in consumer price inflation. Given the global reliance on oil, any significant disruption to Middle Eastern oil supplies could lead to major price hikes, directly impacting inflation. The relationship between Middle Eastern conflict and oil prices has been observed repeatedly over decades. During the 1973 oil crisis, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, imposed an oil embargo, causing oil prices to quadruple and leading to severe inflationary pressures worldwide. Research from the Harvard Kennedy School emphasizes that supply shocks from conflict-prone regions like the Middle East tend to create long-lasting effects on global prices as markets adjust to reduced supply levels. While today's economy is more diversified in its energy sources, oil remains indispensable for many industries, especially those in manufacturing, logistics, and agriculture. In addition to direct inflationary impacts, rising oil prices have indirect effects on consumer behavior. When the cost of fuel rises, household expenses increase as well, and consumers tend to reduce discretionary spending to compensate for the higher cost of essential goods like gas and heating. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, household spending on non-essentials drops by approximately 1.2% for every 10% rise in oil prices. This reduced spending not only affects retailers but also dampens broader economic growth, as consumer expenditure comprises a significant portion of the US GDP. Therefore, prolonged increases in oil prices due to Middle Eastern instability could stifle economic expansion, pushing the country further towards stagnation. The waning impact of economic stimulus measures during the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government implemented various stimulus packages to stabilize the economy, providing direct payments to individuals, expanded unemployment benefits, and business loans. These measures initially helped buoy the economy by increasing disposable income, thereby stimulating demand. However, the positive impact of these stimulus measures is now fading, as the funds have largely been spent and households face renewed financial pressures. A report by the Brookings Institution highlights that while the stimulus effectively lifted consumer spending and reduced poverty rates temporarily, it is now having a diminishing impact on economic growth. As stimulus checks and unemployment benefits cease, lower-income households in particular are experiencing financial strain once again, reducing their ability to spend and contribute to economic activity. The stimulus-driven rise in spending also contributed to initial inflationary pressures as increased demand outpaced supply for many goods, especially in sectors where supply chains were disrupted by the pandemic. However, as these stimulus effects wane, the economy faces new challenges. According to a study from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, consumer spending growth has slowed significantly since 2021, particularly among households that relied on stimulus payments for financial stability. Many consumers who built up savings from stimulus funds are now seeing those reserves deplete, impacting spending on discretionary items such as dining out, travel, and entertainment, all critical sectors for the post-pandemic economic recovery. Additionally, many businesses that benefited from stimulus loans are now faced with repayment obligations. A Harvard Business School study highlights that as government support diminishes, businesses are increasingly burdened by loan repayments, rising input costs, and reduced consumer demand. Many small businesses, which are particularly vulnerable to these pressures, are struggling to sustain operations. If more businesses reduce hiring or shutter entirely, unemployment may rise, further compounding the slowdown in economic growth and the potential for stagflation. Academic insights into stagflation risks. The interplay of these three factors, tariffs, rising oil prices, and the waning impact of stimulus, creates conditions highly conducive to stagflation, a phenomenon last observed in the 1970s. Stagflation is uniquely challenging because it combines stagnant growth with high inflation, making traditional policy responses less effective. Academic research from the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business emphasizes that stagflation occurs when inflation expectations become embedded in consumer and business behaviors. As prices rise, consumers expect continued inflation, which can create a self-reinforcing cycle of price hikes and reduced spending power. In such an environment, even measures designed to stimulate growth may fail, as rising costs overshadow the benefits of increased spending. In an economic analysis by Princeton University, researchers highlight that supply-side inflation, such as that caused by tariffs or oil price shocks, poses a particular threat because it is not easily controlled through monetary policy. Raising interest rates, the Federal Reserve's usual tool to curb inflation, may not be effective if inflation stems from external factors like tariffs and oil prices. Instead, higher interest rates could exacerbate the slowdown in growth by increasing borrowing costs, reducing consumer spending, and dampening business investment. The analysis further indicates that these conditions could persist for several years if the underlying inflationary drivers remain unresolved, suggesting that the US may face a prolonged period of economic instability if the current trajectory continues. Potential social consequences of persistent economic strain. The social impact of rising inflation, stagnant growth, and the prospect of stagflation should not be underestimated. Economic hardship often translates into social unrest, as people grow frustrated with the cost of living and the perceived ineffectiveness of government policies. Historical examples, such as the 1970s, show that stagflation can lead to increased labour strikes, public protests, and political polarisation. When economic opportunities dwindle and household finances are strained, citizens often seek political solutions that promise relief, which may lead to the rise of populist movements and political instability. Current data indicates similar trends in the US, with polling from the Pew Research Center showing that nearly 60% of Americans feel economically insecure due to inflation and rising living costs. The combination of economic dissatisfaction and political polarization could have far-reaching consequences, especially if inflation remains high and growth continues to slow. In times of economic hardship, trust in government institutions tends to decline, leading to a more fragmented and polarized society. A study from the Rand Corporation notes that persistent economic inequality and high inflation are significant factors contributing to reduced social cohesion and increased political extremism. The broader implications for US economic policy. As these economic pressures continue to mount, the Federal Reserve and policymakers face the challenge of balancing inflation control with growth stimulation. The Federal Reserve has already taken measures to increase interest rates in response to inflation, but this approach may have limited effectiveness in a stagflationary environment where inflation is driven by external and structural factors, such as tariffs and oil prices. Some economists suggest that fiscal policy may need to play a larger role, with targeted support for low- and middle-income households to prevent further declines in consumer spending. However, these solutions are complicated by the need to manage the national debt and avoid further inflationary pressures. A Congressional Budget Office (CBO) report suggests that addressing stagflation will require a nuanced approach that balances fiscal discipline with targeted support for vulnerable populations. The report emphasizes that tax policies and social safety nets could play an essential role in mitigating the worst effects of stagflation by providing direct relief to those most affected by inflation. However, without a comprehensive policy response that addresses the root causes of inflation, including tariffs and energy dependency, the US economy may continue to face prolonged instability. The threat of stagflation looms large. The cumulative effects of tariffs, rising oil prices due to Middle Eastern instability, and the fading impact of economic stimulus are creating inflationary pressures and reducing growth potential, setting the stage for stagflation. The complex nature of these challenges requires a comprehensive policy response, as traditional tools may not be sufficient to mitigate the inflationary effects driven by external factors. If left unchecked, these pressures could lead to a prolonged period of economic and social hardship, similar to the stagflation experienced in the 1970s. Addressing this issue will require careful coordination between fiscal and monetary policies, as well as targeted support for the most vulnerable populations. Without intervention, the US risks not only economic instability, but also the erosion of social cohesion, as rising costs, stagnant wages, and job insecurity weigh heavily on households.